Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. This week on the show, I'm joined by Kip Adams of the National Deer Association to discuss what very well might be the most important action you can take this hunting season: filling a doe tag. All right, welcome back to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by First Light and their Camo for Conservation initiative. And as we are wrapping up the year, we need to talk about a very important issue, something that is important for your future deer hunting: the habitat where you deer hunt, the odds of seeing and killing mature bucks in the future of deer hunting as a privilege that we can participate in, the future of our ability to effectively manage deer populations here in America as hunters, rather than having some other group of folks or service manage deer. That's how important our conversation is today, because we are discussing antlerless deer harvest, why it's becoming something that is increasingly of concern for folks within the deer hunting and conservation world, why we are seeing deer harvest and antlerless harvest in particular declining so substantially across many parts of the country, why that's a risk, why that's a problem, why that could lead to worse deer hunting opportunities for you, and all those other things I mentioned. All of this we discuss with my guest today, Mr. Kip Adams, the top dog when it comes to conservation. Chief Conservation Officer, I believe, is his title at the National Deer Association. And he's going to detail for us all of these things, explain why for almost all of us in the United States of America, other than a few areas of the northern reaches of the country where there are some lower deer populations, but most of the country, we have a very, very healthy deer population, if not too healthy. Too many deer that are impacting the health of the deer herd, impacting the health of the habitat, and impacting all of the things. So that's the game plan today, discussing why all that's of concern, why that's a problem, and then how we can do something about it. Discussing everything from, how to determine whether or not all of this applies to you and your property. That's a key thing. Which kinds of places do need increased doe harvest? Which places don't? I want to make sure you can answer that question effectively. Number two, which does should you be shooting? The mature doe, the young doe. How do you determine if it's a buck fawn or a mature doe? How do you make sure that this is not a shed buck and it is a doe? All of these different questions we cover, as well as many others. And then finally, we talk through some techniques, some strategies, some ideas for how you can fill those antlerless tags. So we're going to talk why, we're going to talk how, we're going to talk when, and hopefully get you all up to speed on what you can do to make a positive difference as a deer hunter, and also sharing the meat, sharing this with other folks who might be in need as well. That is the plan. This is how we're going to wrap up the year. It's going to be an important episode. If you have a week left of the season, 2 weeks left of the season, I know some of you guys have more, whatever it is, please, if this applies to you in your area, if you live in one of those places where you have those growing deer populations where not enough does are getting killed, please join me in participating in filling another doe tag or two. I know that I have goals of getting 5 plus more. We have an extended doe season this year in Michigan, so our season's going to go into mid-January, I guess it is. And I'm going to be participating right on through the gory end of it. Hopefully going to put some more meat in the freezer, share some with some family and friends, and have a really good time along the way. So that's the plan. Without any further ado, here's my chat with Kip Adams. All right, here with me back on the line is Kip Adams. Thank you, Kip, for being here again.
Absolutely, Mark. Thanks for having me.
I always enjoy our chats. I always appreciate you making the time to do this. And today we are here with, I think what's fair to say is an urgent call to action for anyone listening. And I'm titling this episode, I think, by saying something, by titling it as maybe the most important action you can take this hunting season. Something like that, Kip. And I'm curious, from your perspective, is killing an antlerless deer, filling an antlerless deer tag, would that qualify as one of the most important actions a deer hunter can take this season in your mind?
Absolutely, and there are certainly places in across the whitetails range where deer herds, are very low, and antlerless harvest is, a light harvest is appropriate. But those places are few and far between. Most places where we have whitetails, because the reproductive rate is so high, it just necessitates that hunters fill more antlerless tags than we've been filling across much of the range, boy, over most of the past decade. So yeah, I'd
Yeah.
agree with you. That's one of the most important things we can do to ensure the future. We have a healthy deer herd next year and well into the future.
So this is something that I'm seeing pop up more and more with a sense of urgency from people in the whitetail hunting conservation community. Definitely from the
Mhm.
National Deer Association and other agencies around the country related to deer, organizations related to deer. This kind of flashing red light saying we need to take more antlerless deer, we need to shoot more does, we need to manage the populations more. What's going on for people who maybe have not been hearing this, who haven't been paying attention? What are these things that are making this so concerning where we are right now, and why has there been this increasing, level of concern
Mhm.
around if we're taking enough does, and people saying, hey, take more does, take more does? I mean, we in the state of Michigan, our deer lead deer biologist sent a very explicit letter, I think it was last year, to all hunters in the state of Michigan saying, like, hey, you have to start taking
Mhm.
more does. Otherwise, we will not be able to have deer hunting as a management tool in the way we are right now. So it's getting to a pretty serious level here now. Can you just catch people up to speed if they have not been paying attention to this and not have been seeing this? What is causing this level of concern? Why is this becoming an issue?
Sure. Well, as hunters, one of the most important things we can do is, make sure that we harvest enough antlerless deer to balance deer herds with what our habitats can support. And that often is at odds with what hunters want to see. And I'm the same way. When I go hunting, I want to see deer. And, if I can see a lot of deer, that's fun. I get it. That's fun. So as hunters, nobody wants to go and says, man, I hope I don't see very many deer today. Well, we equate that to how many antlers do we shoot? Well, if we shoot that deer, then there's fewer deer in the landscape, so we can't see as much. Um, but the reality of it is, we need to shoot appropriate numbers of antlerless deer to not have more than our areas can support. Not as many as we want to see, because most areas cannot support as many deer as we would like to see as hunters. So historically, we did a great job shooting bucks and not shooting does. And that worked really well when we were trying to recover deer herds across most of the range. And it's funny to think back, 1999 is the first year in the US that we shot more antlerless deer than bucks. Now, I know a lot of your listeners weren't born in 1999 yet, and there's a lot of new hunters that makes that sound like ancient times. But think about it, we've been hunting whitetails, in the U.S. almost 100 years under regulated hunting before we shot more does and bucks. And that's really the whole QDM movement. That's when the QDMA was started. So hey, let's teach people the value of shooting doe. So fast forward, Mark, with a lot of education from we're out the year 2000 up to the year about 2010. Hunters really answered the call, and we're harvesting more antlerless deer than bucks every year through that time, which was great. For the first time ever, we were getting deer herds pretty much in balance with what our habitats could support. That was awesome. Well, somewhere around 2011, 2012, we had a couple of terrible hemorrhagic disease years. We had some other things going on where hunters had reduced deer herds. Other sides of mortality kind of took over, and suddenly deer herds dipped a little bit in many places, and it scared the heck out of hunters. So that's when they said, whoa, let's back off. And since the early 2010s, we have just been harvesting fewer and fewer and fewer antlerless deer. That's what really brings us to where we are today, because with everything, that pendulum kind of swings one way where, man, we're harvesting a lot of antlerless deer. Folks get nervous. Right now, it's kind of swung all the way to the other end where we're just protecting them too much. And as proof of this, we look at percentage of hunters in the US that are successful. A decade ago, it was about 48% of all hunters would shoot a deer annually. That's just one. Most people think, man, hunters are going out where everybody's killing multiple deer. The reality is over half of the hunters don't shoot a single deer. If you look at now, today, that's only about 40% of hunters are successful.
Wow.
So what's happening is hunters are just choosing not to shoot deer. This isn't a matter of there's no deer available, deer herds are too low. This is hunters making conscious decisions. I am not going to pull the trigger on, in many cases, that doe. So that's what's led us to where we are today. We're just harvesting deer at a lower rate at a time when deer herds are growing across most of the range. That's why you have more state wildlife agencies than ever before today imploring their hunters, please take an antlerless deer. So that's what really probably brings you and I to sitting together here this morning talking.
Yeah. So are there any, I guess, what are the signs that this is actually happening? So I know people are worried about it. I know the state agencies are worried about it. Have we seen this in the actual harvest reports? I mean, I believe we have, because I think you and I have talked about this during some of our deer report conversations. But it seems like this is now translating to lower harvest numbers in the states that they're reporting. I think I've saw in Michigan, like you said, or maybe this is something I was reading earlier today, just about the fact that our deer harvest numbers have been going down dramatically in Michigan, like something like 25% decline maybe last year or something along those lines. So this is translating. This isn't just like a vibes thing. This is like a real data thing too, correct?
That's absolutely right. And states are measuring this with reduced antlerless harvest. And this is at a time mark where we are at historically high buck harvest. So we are killing as many or more bucks today than we have almost every year in the past 100 years. So what that means is it shows us that deer herds are continue to expand. That's how you have more bucks on the landscape. So we have actual data showing reduced antlerless harvest in many states, increasing buck harvest in many states that shows the deer herd is growing. We have reduced nutritional planes in many states as they're collecting biological data on deer. So they know, kidney fat index is showing deer are going into winter with lower fat levels, body weights by age class dropping. There's lots of different indicators showing we clearly have more deer. And in many places, more deer than we have good, high quality food available. So yeah, there's, states measure this stuff differently, but, many, many states today have absolute solid data showing deer herds are growing like crazy. We're shooting fewer does. We're not shooting fewer bucks. We're shooting fewer does. And that's why we really have to, get it's fun to be shooting these bucks. That's awesome. I love too. Now's where the step is, hey, as hunters, you got that buck. That's awesome. Now let's follow that up and make sure you get a doe, or in many cases, a couple of does for each of those bucks that you're shooting.
Okay. So, what does this look like if this trend continues? I guess what I'm getting at here, what I want to better understand is what is the risk of inaction if we don't change this trend? If the deer populations continue to swell and we as hunters cannot manage them in balance with the habitat, in balance with the herd, what negative ramifications might be in store?
Well, first of all, if we're not harvesting enough does so that deer herds get too high, the first ramification is, our deer herd health starts to suffer. They're just not getting, enough food to meet their growth requirements, or certainly not to meet what their potential is. So that means body weights get smaller, means they can raise fewer fawns. It means antlers get smaller, none of which hunters want. So that is the impact to deer. Then there's the impact to the habitat. If there's more deer than there should be, our habitats become degraded, and then it can hold even fewer deer in the future. So that's the bad part of habitats. All those other wildlife species out there that share that habitat with deer, now they're negatively impacted. So it's negatively impacting those. And then from a hunter end, we continue to have higher crop damage, dollar amounts because of deer. We continue to have more other deer-human conflicts like deer vehicle collisions, etc. So as those things increase, that just makes hunting become less important if we're not doing the job that we want. Only about 4% of our society hunts. You and I are in the distinct minority, and our kids, and we don't get to do anything in this country because 4% of us want to do it. And I heard people say it's my God-given right to hunt. And man, I wish it was, but that's not true. We get to hunt today because between 75 and 80% of American adults support legal, ethical, regulated hunting. And they support that, even though most of those don't, they support it because they see hunters providing that free service to society. part of that, or a big part of that, is harvesting enough antlerless deer to keep deer herds healthy. So as hunters, we want to do the best job possible to be providing that service to society so that we get to continue to do it. Because if we don't, society's going to find an answer somehow. I'm doing everything possible every day of work to make sure that hunters are the champions and the ones that continue. So that's why we try to educate hunters on, hey, this is why it's in our best benefit to be shooting antlerless deer and be mentoring other people and encouraging them to shoot antlerless deer. We're not looking to get rid of all the deer. We're just looking to harvest enough so that we have a deer herd in balance with its habitat. So that's very healthy deer herds, healthy habitat. And then, that is what will allow us to hunt into perpetuity.
Yeah. Yeah. It's what's concerning, or one of the things that's really concerning when you look down the road, is what happens when white-tailed deer are looked at as more of a nuisance and a pest and a detriment than as a benefit to the natural world and to society. And already, like we've heard for many years, like insurance companies not wanting there to be so many deer because of that. You're hearing more and more in city and suburban environments where deer are damaging not only cars and people's lives, but then also landscaping, whatever it might be. But I think a thing that's popping up more and more, at least in my world, in areas that I'm reading about and studying, I'm reading more and more about people within the environmental community and the larger conservation world looking at deer as one of the largest detriments to biodiversity and ecosystem health across the country, as this vast overpopulation of deer is destroying important habitat types that are important to pollinating insects, birds, all these other critters that need a healthy, thriving habitat. In areas where deer are overpopulated and we're not managing them, they're just crushing habitat, which then is impacting all these other at-risk species. And like you said, if hunters aren't seen as a viable way to manage these deer in balance with the habitat, people are going to seek out other solutions, and we will lose our opportunities because of that. So I think, you've seen some of these things happen in suburban environments and city environments where cities and townships are hiring sharpshooters to manage deer populations. I don't know what that's going to look like and if that will continue to scale in some kind of way if we don't step up to the plate. But what are your thoughts on this biodiversity impact that I continue to read more and more about, people looking at white-tailed deer as a threat to many other species of wildlife because they're, in some areas, just really leveling the vegetation. You see these browse lines that are clearly defined lines across the landscape where there's hardly anything beneath it. Can you discuss that a little bit more?
Sure. And that's absolutely true what you're saying. And, that's one of the reasons deer are known to be a keystone species. They have the ability to negatively or positively impact, the area that they're living. There's very few other species that can impact it to that level. Beavers are one example. A beaver can come in and absolutely change the habitat where they are. Deer are at the top of that list because deer are so good at surviving. Think about this. Deer are the oldest, whitetails are the oldest deer species we have. They've been around for over 4 million years. They are good at surviving, in many cases at the exclusion of other things that they share the area with. So, even if we do a poor job managing them, they continue to find a way to at least survive, maybe at lower levels than they are now, but they're going to continue. Now, as they do that, this is where they are negatively impacting that for all those other wildlife species are out there, and where this whole biodiversity concern comes in, and, in that conversation. Conversely, if we do a good job managing them, they can be the champion for everything else. That's why the Value of Deer campaign, that we're so proud of and are spearheading now, is to let all those people out there that talk about the biodiversity or are concerned with that may not hunt, to make them aware of all of the positive things that deer provide, in large part funding for our wildlife programs, to protect all of those other species out there, butterflies and bees and non-game and small game. So when we get it right, oh my gosh, we are, the champion of champions. Deer are the vehicle to make that happen. So as managers, we know how to put a game plan together. We need the hunters to implement it. And then when hunters implement it correctly by shooting appropriate numbers of antlerless deer, man, it is so good for all of that biological diversity. When we fail to implement that part correctly, that's when it all starts to fall apart. And that huge segment of public that doesn't hunt starts looking at hunting in a negative light. So that's what we're trying to guard against here.
Yeah. And I think we're starting to see a larger proportion of our community recognizing the positive impact that we can have, right, on the larger natural world, on the environment, especially those of us who are fortunate to have land that we can manage and improve. Like we've seen, many of us have seen the absolutely tangible impacts we can have on the landscape by, improving the early successional habitat component, or planting food plots, or managing timber, or whatever it might be. All of those things help deer, and they help all of these other creatures. And so many of us are starting to see the value there and how we can benefit everything. We can benefit the biodiversity. But a really important piece, like one of the very most important things we can do, maybe more important than making some of these habitat improvements, or just as, is this deer antlerless harvest management component of it. If you just improve habitat, but you're not managing the doe population, you probably are, you're missing out on a huge upside that could be there if you were to do both, right?
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
they go hand in hand. Now, another thing here that I have heard increasingly getting bandied around, and something that I think is concerning to many hunters, is one of the more aggressive proposals that I have been hearing for those people within the government or otherwise trying to manage the deer population. People saying, hey, we got to get these deer populations down. It's becoming dangerous. It's damaging the environment. It's et cetera, et cetera. The idea of putting a dollar value on deer again and allowing folks to monetize them and opening up market hunting to some degree again to try to incentivize harvest. Can you speak to how viable that is? Is that a real threat? Is that actually possible down the line? And why is that concerning if it were to happen?
I think that I'll answer the first question there is that a real threat? I think absolutely. We have markets and wildlife in other places. You're allowed to sell muskrat meat in Maryland. That's done all the time. We sell hides of fur bearers. We sell fish. So, deer are not allowed in that. When we ended the whole market hunting back in the early 1900s, that's what saved deer populations. And it's been such an integral part of our North American model of wildlife conservation. No markets for that. Well, there's always been loopholes around that, not for deer, but for other species. So is it a viable discussion? I think absolutely. And I think it's something, that should scare the heck out of a lot of hunters. We have the opportunity to fix this right now. That, in my opinion, commercializing whitetails would be a bad idea for the future of wildlife management. I don't think that's good. And I'm not somebody that's a traditionalist and just has to go by what we have done in the past. I am all about finding solutions and thinking out of the box. I just personally don't think that is a good one for whitetails, at least not now. Maybe in the future that may be necessary, but right now I do not think that's a positive thing for deer or the future of our wildlife management programs. But it's absolutely something that's being talked about more. And as the number of hunters, that at least the percentage of the U.S. population that hunts continues to decline, that is something that will become a more real discussion and something that could absolutely be on the table for hunters in the foreseeable future.
Yeah. So again, another clear reason why we need to take control of this issue now ourselves rather than let somebody else take control of the narrative and put those kinds of solutions on the table, right?
For sure. For sure.
Okay, so one of the things that we always hear when the topic of antlerless harvest comes up is, well, there's no deer in my area, or everyone already shoots all the does where I am, or this will crush the deer population where I live. I'm not going to do that. How can someone determine whether or not this issue applies to them? How can you determine whether or not you should be harvesting antlerless deer where you hunt?
Well, I think that what hunters need to recognize is that all of our state wildlife agencies, implement our hunting seasons, and they manage deer on a wildlife management unit or a deer management unit or deer management zone basis. As hunters, we hunt at the property level. Our wildlife agencies aren't managing deer at the level that we hunt. They're managing them on a larger scale. And then we need to realize that across those units, there are places where there's more deer than there should be. There may be some places where there's fewer deer than they should be, and somewhere it's right about in balance. So that's where you hear someone say, there are no deer in my unit. Well, maybe there's no deer on your property. That's probably not true, but just understand that, you know what, throughout that unit you're hunting in, there has been a lot of data collected by your state wildlife agency, and that's why they have applied that harvest, the level, whether, it's moderate or high or whatever. So don't be arguing that that's wrong for that whole unit. Now, within the property that you hunt on, and hey, I hunt at the property level, and so do you, and so do every other hunter. From that, there are ways to be able to figure out, should I shoot any does? Should it be one? Should it be multiple? And there's some scientific information that I can give you. The easiest thing, Mark, is actually on our website, we have a doe harvest diagnosis. It's a page you can look at, and there's a bunch of questions. You just answer yes or no to each. And at the end, you count up the number of yeses, the number of nos, and it tells you, should you be harvesting more deer in your area or not? So if folks want to go do that, that's an easy way to do that. But I will tell you, in general, across most of the whitetails range, a good place to start is for hunters to be harvesting at least as many antlerless deer as they are bucks on the property that they hunt. There's places in New England, there's places, in northern Minnesota or Wisconsin or Nebraska where deer herds are, not real productive, or at least not growing quick, that you just simply can't harvest as many does there. But that is not true for most of the whitetails range. Almost all the whitetails range, we need to be harvesting at least as many antlerless deer, and in most cases, more antlerless deer than bucks. Everybody can apply that right to your property level. If you're hunting at your Michigan camp, and we shot 5 bucks this year, I will promise you should have been shooting more than 5 does, and in many cases, probably at least twice that many. My hunting camp in northern Pennsylvania, our 20-year average is we shoot between 3 and 4 antlerless deer for every antlered buck that we shoot. And we have phenomenal hunting. Lots of folks say, well, man, you guys shoot nice bucks. I wish I could hunt there. Well, part of the good hunting is we work hard on the habitat, and we work really hard to shoot enough antlerless deer each year. So, those go together. But that's a good place for folks to start. Start by shooting more does than bucks.
Where do we find that doe harvest diagnosis tool you mentioned on the website? Where can folks go?
It is at deerassociation.com. There under, I think it's under one of our programs or materials available. Gosh, it's been so long since I have looked on the site. I know we have it there, but it's on our site. It's a 1-page PDF that folks can grab. And to make it easy, Mark, what I can do when we get done here, I can send you or email that to you if you wanted to include a link to it in the show notes or something. But
yeah. We'll have a link in the show notes.
I'll make that available, because that's a super easy way. If somebody says, hey, you know what? I actually collect data. I do camera surveys, or I scout a lot. A good rule of thumb is, if you want to stabilize a deer herd, shoot 20 to 30% of the does each year, which means if you shoot fewer than 20 to 30%, that deer herd is likely going to grow. If you want to reduce the deer herd, shoot more than 20 to 30% of the does. So, say you do a camera survey and, hey, I got 10 does using my property. If you shoot 2 or 3, you probably will keep that deer herd right there. If you shoot, 4 to 5, there's a chance you're going to reduce it. So that's a good rule of thumb as well. And that's what I have used. We do summer camera surveys on our Pennsylvania farm. I have every year for over 20 years. That is exactly what I do to estimate, hey, here's probably how many different bucks are using our farm during the year. And then this is how many does we're going to shoot. We go into every deer season with a plan. And I tell all the guys hunting our land, we're going to shoot, 8 to 10 does this year, or we're going to shoot, 18 to 20 does this year. So that comes from that camera survey. Not everybody can do that. So that's why we also developed that doe harvest diagnosis sheet I mentioned. So you just go through it and answer yes or no, and then come up with what your strategy should be.
Terrific. And like you said, for probably 3/4 of the nation, the answer is an obvious yes. Definitely for anyone in the bottom 2/3 of my home state here in Michigan. I think you'd be hard pressed to find anywhere in this state other than the far northern reaches where there's just not a pile of deer in most areas that need this kind of action. But despite that fact, people, I have friends and folks I know who have the same questions, concerns, or excuses for not shooting does beyond just, well, there's not enough deer. So you wrote an article recently for the NDA's website that covered some of these. I wanted to talk through a few with you. And one of them is something I've heard from people, which is Well, my state has such a crazy high bag limit. They'll like in Michigan, I think you can buy 10 doe tags. They're trying to
Mm.
shoot every dang deer out there. All these deer must be getting killed. There's no way I should shoot a bunch of them because everybody else is. Or, I've been hearing there's depredation tags being given out. I've heard of some farmers shooting 50 deer every year over here. I better not do it myself. Can you speak to that one a little bit?
Sure. And and I get it. I'm the same way if I'm hearing what's going on in my town or down at the local bar or local coffee shop, yeah, I heard Mark shot 3 and he had people over his probably shot 10 and that story gets shared and suddenly you wonder why there's any deer left in your whole township, they're
Right.
gone. The reality of it is that's not true. The reality of it is we monitor harvest success rates from every state in the country annually and less than half of the hunters that go afield any year shoot a single deer, and about half of those that do shoot bucks. If you're only going to shoot one deer, many people prefer a buck, so most won't shoot any. A good percentage shoot a bucks, which means then there's a large percentage that don't shoot any does. So we've shared some data to show, hey, most people don't kill a single doe, even though you have the opportunities to kill multiple does, all those years. The reality of it is most are not. So that's the first thing we try to share with folks, just to make them aware we're not making this up. Here's what the data actually says. You don't need to be afraid to shoot one because you think they're all gone or that they're over harvested. Most people just simply aren't shooting that at all. So we try to make that available because if hunters see that and start to understand that, that's the first step to reducing those barriers that maybe we can convince them to pull the trigger on a doe.
All right, here's another one. Well, I don't want to shoot a doe in the late season when we're discussing this right now because that doe has already been bred by the big giant buck that I hope is running around out here, and I don't want to lose that future buck. I don't want the genetics from that big buck to disappear because I shoot the doe that he bred. What about that one?
I think with that one, I say, you know what? You were right. You should have shot that doe back in September or October. Then you wouldn't have had to worry about it. There's a lot of benefits to early antlerless harvest. And I would love if we could shoot all the does on us, in October. The reality of it is, that just doesn't happen. So we get into, the rut and then we're post rut. From a biological standpoint, it makes absolutely no difference to that deer herd, whether you shot that doe early in the year or after she had been bred. Think about it like this. We know that a lot of the bucks out there get in on the breeding. And in fact, research shows that about a quarter of all the twin fawns we see aren't real twins. They have different fathers. So we know that not only are a lot of bucks breeding, we know that some does are bred by multiple bucks. So between that, we know, and the other research done on actual antler growth and who's siring who, boy, from a hunting standpoint, Mark, we can't do anything to impact antler genetics in the wild. We can absolutely impact antler growth by making sure that there's not too many deer for an area and making sure that bucks are getting into older age classes. Those are two things that hunters can do every single day. We can do absolutely nothing about the actual genetics of what those fawns have, from their sires. So from that, if somebody is saying, man, I don't want to shoot a doe now that's bred from, it maybe have bred by the biggest buck. You don't know that. Probably was not bred by him. And even if he was, that's not a guarantee that fawn will have big antlers if it is a buck fawn. So that doesn't even need to come into, the conversation at all.
So I want to reiterate or have you reiterate something you said there. For those people listening who are really fired up about big giant bucks, they can't influence how many big giant bucks they're going to have by shooting call bucks, because we've talked in the past about how, as you just said, we can't really influence genetics. You can't influence it by making sure that the genetics of a certain buck are passed on by not shooting a doe. But there was something you did say could influence the antlers of future deer, which is making sure there's not too many deer in the landscape, right?
That's correct. Age is the biggest influence for antler size, just letting them get old enough to express what their potential is. The next biggest thing is just nutrition, making sure and I will say this, I've been blessed to travel across the country, actually, and across the world to talk about whitetails and work with whitetails. In almost every place I have been, those deer would have benefited from more nutrition. Even in Southeast Iowa, I have been in some of the best whitetail country in the world that grows some of the biggest whitetails. And in those areas, those bucks could be even bigger if there were fewer deer there and they had more food. So as hunters, we do that by enhancing habitat and by shooting does so that we reduce the number of mouths competing for that good food that we provide.
Yeah. All right, moving down the list. How about, well, I don't want to shoot does right now or at any time of year because I don't want to accidentally shoot a button buck, which will then be my future booner that I'm, working towards and spending all this money on improving habitat for and got all my fancy hunting gear to shoot. I don't want to shoot my bucks by accident. What do you say to someone who's worried about that? And how can we prepare, or what can we do to ensure that doesn't happen?
I think one, tell them, hey, thank you for at least considering shooting an antlerless deer. Thank you for being cognizant enough to understand the difference between buck fawns, doe fawns, and adult does, and try to do a better job from a manager standpoint and shoot a doe as opposed to a future buck. Because by passing buck fawns, yes, you can have more bucks on the landscape, but also by shooting that adult doe, you are doing a better job helping manage that deer herd by reducing, one of the breeding females. So that is all very good. There's nothing wrong with being concerned about that. In fact, it shows that you have a little more respect for that deer herd and want to do a good job as a steward. Now I'll say this, there is nothing wrong with shooting fawns. Absolutely nothing wrong with either buck fawns or doe fawns. So, you don't need to feel bad about that. And there's a great rule of thumb that shows, all of your antlerless harvest, as long as about 10% of that are buck fawns, you're totally fine. You're not negatively impacting the future of that at all. Now, if 50 or 60% of your antlerless harvest are buck fawns, you are absolutely going to negatively impact what you have. But as long as you keep that total antlerless harvest to about 10% buck fawns or lower, man, there is nothing wrong at all. So know that going in. Okay, now I see some antlerless deer. How can I do the best job picking out or making sure one is a doe and not a fawn? Well, if you shoot them earlier in the year, it's easier to tell because there's a greater size difference. I like that. But now, man, those buck fawns can be about as big as some of the adult does, particularly the 1.5-year-old does. So with that, there's a couple things we can look at, Mark, from a physical standpoint and a behavioral standpoint that'll help us. So from a physical standpoint, fawns are still a little smaller, but if we look at the bodies, like if you're seeing broadside deer, an adult doe, if you look at the space between her front legs and her back legs, it is rectangular. That same area on a fawn is more square because they're just not as long as a doe. Yeah. That's why it helps having, multiple deer available, because just looking at one, you can be tricked pretty easily. But if you have two there to compare, that makes it a lot easier. If we can see their head, the distance from a fawn's forehead to its eye is about the same as its eye to its end of its nose. So that if you look at the fawn's whole head in profile, the eye is about right in the middle. An adult doe, the distance from her forehead to her eye are shorter than the distance from her eye to her nose. You can see that long. And I have identified so many antlerless deer as a doe or a fawn based solely on looking at that head from the side. Yeah. If we see them from the front, a fawn's ears appear larger relative to its whole head than a doe's. So we can use that as well. So ears, face, and body, there's three things from a physical standpoint that we can help differentiate between those two, even before we get to any of the behavioral stuff. So those are all great indicators. From a physical or a behavioral standpoint, then, we can watch at how they interact. Fawns are less wary than adults, so they're almost always the first deer that shows up at a food source, particularly a food plot or some other area that doesn't have much cover. Maybe you're hunting some oak woods and there's a big open oak flat. Hey, they're often the first ones in there as well. So seeing the first deer come in, waiting to harvest on that one, until another one is present can help you pick an adult doe. Or, hey, if you want to shoot a fawn, you can bet that, the first one in there is a good chance it is a fawn. If you have multiple deer there, now you can watch not only the size, but behaviorally as well, who appears to be in charge. Oftentimes adult does will go over, and it can either smack a fawn to remove them from an area, or the fawn will follow the doe and it's very clear kind of who's in charge. So we can watch some of that behavior as well and do a really good job identifying that. And then from that, the last thing that we can look at is if we see the head shape. Even without antlers, bucks have a very flat head. So whether a buck that has shed its antlers or a buck fawn, it's very flat between the ears. Does have rounded heads. So it's really, really easy to tell that when they're in summer coat. It becomes a little more difficult in winter coat, but if we study them, we can still see that. So that's a great way to differentiate buck fawns from doe fawns, buck fawns from adult does, or even bucks that have shed their antlers from adult does. So with a little bit of study, and I will say this, it makes that way easier if we have some good optics. So, don't go hunting without your binoculars. I'd never leave home without my Vortex binoculars. And I spend more time in them than I do my scope. And I confirm what's going on there before I go to my scope. So good optics really help. Not shooting in real low light situations can help, or waiting until there's better light can certainly help that as well. So, there's things that we can look at on the deer. There's things we can observe from deer. And there's some things we can do from a hunting end as well to all, improve the chances that we're shooting adult does and not buck fawns or any fawn or even shed bucks.
Yeah. So on that shed buck topic, that's another one that people are worried about. So the obvious thing, as you described there, was to make sure to check out that head with your binos and carefully study the forehead. But from the body perspective or anything else, when it comes to determining or differentiating a mature doe from a shed buck, are there any other things you would recommend looking for?
Yeah, and that is a legitimate concern as well. And I'm very cognizant when I'm hunting in late December or January of watching an antlerless deer to make sure it's not a shed buck. So one, I am making sure that I use my optics like we just discussed. Two, I am watching structurally on that deer. Bucks at that time of the year, for most of the whitetails range, my buddies down in Alabama and Louisiana and the places that rut really late, this is a little different for them, but for most of the country, where our bucks rut in early to mid-November, late season, once they have shed, structurally looking at them, they are often just thin looking. They are rectangular between the front legs and back legs, like the does we talked about, but they tend to be slim because they just don't eat much during the rut. And there's a lot of data that shows they'll lose 20 to 25% of their body weight during the rut. So they can get pretty slim. That's why at food sources, they're trying to eat all they can to put on anything possible, before we get into full winter. So looking at them, if you're looking at a deer late season, I clearly see it's an adult. Can't really see the head good, but just looking at the body, if that body looks pretty round or pretty fit, it's probably a doe. It's probably not a buck that's gone through the rigors of the rut. Conversely, if you look at it and go, ooh, that looks a little slim, there's a better than average chance that can be a buck, or it's a doe that's just really nutritionally deprived. But that's something that I use. Behaviorally, those bucks still act a little different from the does. Once they lose their antlers, they know they don't have them anymore. So they're not as apt to, fight another buck, but they still often act to be a little bit in charge, over the does. So if you see a bunch of deer, particularly in say a food plot, or maybe you have corn, and you watch a deer come in that just seems to look like attitude is a little more in charge, or just kind of in many cases, that is a buck that shed their antlers. They don't often lose that whole attitude, when the antlers are gone. So just behaviorally, there's some you can as well. But if I'm hunting in, I am just really, really studying. Is that head flat or not? And trying to pick up on those other cues, because, man, a buck that makes it through, into late season, if he has shed his antlers from whatever, I don't want to be shooting him either. I want to make sure I'm putting my tag on a doe. So I take extra care and I'm extra cautious that time of year.
Is tarsal gland stain something that can reliably help you differentiate it all at that point in the year?
That's a great point. Sometimes, yes. Bucks and does will rub urinate year round. They will do that. They just tend to do it a lot more during the rut, and bucks tend to do it more during the rut than does. So once their testosterone levels start dropping and they're out of the rut, they're not rub urinating as much, but you still will see that dark tarsal staining on bucks, and particularly older bucks that have rub urinated a lot. It hangs around there a lot longer than it does in does. So it's not an absolute telltale sign every single time, but that's a great suggestion, Mark, and one thing that you can use, as one more clue to, hey, is that likely a buck or is that more likely a doe? So yeah, that's a really good tip.
Yeah. Okay. So another question, and this isn't so much a should you hunt does or not. This is okay, I've decided I'm going to start hunting does. One of the other questions that you get is, okay, which doe is the best to shoot? Because a whole pile of them just came out into the cornfield or just came out in front of me in the clearing, and I've got a whole bunch of different ones. I see some big ones, I see some little ones, I see one with two fawns, I see one all by itself. What is the best doe to shoot if I want to try to make an impact on the herd, as we are discussing? If I want to help manage the doe herd to bring down that population or at least stabilize it, what doe should I be shooting?
The older does tend to be better mothers. So they tend to recruit more fawns. So if you're looking at reducing a deer herd, shooting an older doe can help the most. However, we can't estimate age of does on the hoof like we can bucks. So that's a very, very difficult thing to do. So what I tell people to do is, and this is exactly the advice that I follow, if I am looking at a group of deer and I've identified, they're all does or there's does and fawns, or if, all the deer, or at least all the adults there are does, I am picking the biggest one out. I am shooting the biggest doe in the group. That is more likely to be a doe as opposed to a fawn. It's going to harvest deer from across a wide range of ages. The biggest deer there is not necessarily the oldest. I have seen 2-year-old doe win big doe contests. I've seen 3-year-old doe, 4-year-old doe, 5-year-old doe, kind of like humans. Some of us tend to get a lot bigger than others. Some just don't grow as big. So by harvesting the biggest doe in the group, you're going to get the most meat for the freezer, which is good, minimize the chance of harvesting a fawn, and then you're going to then also help harvest deer from across the whole range of age classes, which is really good for the deer herd. Maybe as an individual landowner, that's not important, but overall, that's very good. So that's my advice. And if the biggest deer there was guaranteed to be the oldest, that's great. But since we can't figure out which is the oldest, sometimes behaviorally, you can watch interactions, and the more dominant one tends to be the older one. But a very easy piece of advice that I think across the board works really well is pick the biggest one out so that you can put the most meat in your freezer.
Yeah. I read recently about a study that came out somewhat recently about the possibility of there being super does, being does that are disproportionately impacting the population. Is that something you can elaborate on at all? Have you seen that?
I haven't seen that. I'm guessing they're probably talking about the ones that are recruiting more fawns, maybe, or just tend to be better mothers, because they would have larger impacts, on the deer herd. There's no doubt some do a better job recruiting fawns. All of them, 99% of them are going to be bred. Most of them will then be able to deliver fawns. Some just do a better job recruiting them, and recruiting means they keep that fawn alive till they're 6 months of age and they get into the fall deer herd. The most dominant does get the best fawning areas. Oftentimes, the best fawning areas are the ones that they are able to recruit the most fawns from, because it's where they can hide best from predators. It's where you have the best food available to the mother to feed that fawn. So some of that, Mark, is that they just have qualities that make them better at protecting fawns. Some of it is they're just the dominant doe in an area, so they have all of the things stacked in their favor to be able to actually recruit those fawns. And nutrition is a big thing there. If you take a doe on an area, the dominant doe, big healthy doe, take the quality of the milk that she's feeding her fawn. The quality of that is exactly the same as the most nutritionally deprived doe on that area. One is not better than the other. The difference is that doe that has a bunch of food produces way more milk for her fawn. So that fawn will grow much faster because they have a lot more resources. They grow faster. They grow quicker than others. They are faster at an earlier age than others, so they're better able to avoid predators, and they tend to be bigger in the fall. So that's why it's important for us to make sure that we don't have too many mouths on the landscape, because then does can actually raise more fawns. Every other fawn on average is a buck fawn because they're born at about a 50-50 ratio. So for people to say, I want the most bucks, I say, God bless you. I do too. I like to see bucks, and that keeps people hunting. Do that by shooting enough does so the does are as healthy as popular. That's when they can recruit the most fawns. That's how you recruit the most bucks on the landscape. So, man, when we do things right, it all works out good to benefit us.
Yeah.
And I believe the hunters want to do things right. So sharing information like that with them can help convince them of the need and the benefit of shooting a doe.
Now, speaking of fawns, a lot of people have worries or questions about shooting a doe with fawns. So we're sitting there in the tree stand and a mature looking doe and two fawns step out into the open in front of you. What are your thoughts for someone who is faced with the shoot or don't shoot question at that point? Because some people have worries about that.
Absolutely. Nope. Great question. Most of our fawns, in the northern half of the U.S. anyway, where deer are rutting in November, most of the fawns are born in May and June. That means they are weanable by mid to late August. By 10 weeks of age, they're weanable. They could live on their own. Now, we don't have deer seasons in August, partly because of that. By the time our deer seasons start, those fawns are totally fine to make it on their own if they have been orphaned. So what I tell people is there is no biological concern of harvesting that doe. Those fawns will survive, or at least there's a good chance that they're going to survive. The only time I would be hesitant is if those fawns still have spots. If it's a spotted fawn, man, there's a lot of benefit to leaving that mother with him for a longer period of time. Now, obviously, the doe will continue to help them avoid predators in that, but we don't need to worry about most of that for the most part. If the fawn is spotted, don't shoot that doe. Give it fawn more time with it. But if you're into deer season, that fawn, is not spotted, it is eating vegetation. It is going to group up with other deer anyway. There is no biological concern with shooting at the mother. Now, if it just makes you queasy and you say, I just don't want to do that, I understand that. Go ahead and shoot a different doe. But understand there is nothing wrong with you or somebody else shooting that doe that has fawns with her. It's not even guaranteed they're both her fawns because fawns group together. And there's some research out of Pennsylvania where they trapped deer and did DNA work. And in many cases, the fawn or fawns that walk in with that doe, they weren't hers. They weren't even related to her. Maybe they lost their mother, so they just grouped up with her. So it's not a guarantee that you're shooting, their mother. It's just a doe in that area. So nothing wrong at all with harvesting that adult doe.
All right. So I'm convinced I need to do more to manage the antlerless deer population in my area. I'm going to go out there and shoot does. But I've listened to 72 podcasts from Wired to Hunt about how to kill big mature bucks. Nobody ever tells me how to kill big old does. Can I get Kip Adams' top 3 tips for killing a doe in the late season, since that's when we're talking?
Sure. And I hope that a bunch of folks have shot them early. If you haven't, it's not too late. We still have season. So once this rut is over, does now are looking also to get as much food as they can getting into winter. So food sources are an awesome time. In the rut, those does are often in heavy cover, just trying to stop from being harassed by bucks. So, hunting really heavy cover is often advantageous. That's where we want to be in many cases to catch those cruising bucks as well. But now that the rut is pretty much over, winter is getting, setting in, does need to feed as much as possible. So food sources are perfect. If you have anything left in food plots, if you have an opportunity to hunt agricultural fields, if you have an opportunity to hunt mast crops, if you're in an all wooded area, find the mast. If there's any acorns left, any beech nuts left, they want that. If not, find areas in wooded areas or wooded situations, that have a bunch of young seedlings. They need those buds. So they're going to do as much as possible to maximize calories that they can take in. So I'm hunting food sources like crazy late season. That is when we stand the best chance to cross paths with a doe.
Beautiful. Have you ever tried any outside the box tactics to fill a doe tag? Do you ever call? Do you ever decoy? Do you ever, I don't know, slip around, spot and stalk? Anything that's a little outside of the norm? Is there anything like that worth considering?
I have not. I don't know that I've ever called in a doe in late season. I often continue to call while I'm hunting. I was running this past Friday night when I was sitting with my nephew in Pennsylvania. Our rut is mostly over, but hey, there's still some does or some bucks that are interested in that. So I think it's fine to call anytime. Deer communicate at a much higher level through, sounds than many hunters realize. So I have never called in a doe late season. I don't know that that's one of the most likely things to call in, but I wouldn't be afraid to try it, just because of the amount of time that they do communicate. I think spot and stalk is totally fine. So I would be very careful because this time of the year, in much of the whitetails range, it gets loud to try to sneak around. It's either crusty snow or we have ice or whatever. So I would be very careful along those lines, but I wouldn't rule that out. I'm thinking food first and whatever I can do to get myself in position to catch one on food or move into food is what I would do. I would not be afraid at all. And actually, I would encourage people to set up outside or different stands that you have hunted most of the season in. You've probably spooked some deer from those stands. Doe are aware of where they had been, chased. So get into other areas. Maybe take a saddle, and hunt out of a saddle in a place you haven't hunted from this year. Maybe even just get out and stand by a tree or sit in an area. Maybe you can't hunt as long as we would have earlier. So, maximize later in the morning, catching deer leaving food or just before an evening, but try spots that you haven't spooked deer from during the course of the year. And hit them from a new area like that can be a great suggestion.
Yeah. One of my favorite things to do in the late season part of the year when I'm focused just on does is I will take the anything is better than nothing approach. So I might not be able to get out for a full morning hunt or a full evening hunt, but I've got from 8:30 to 9:30 in the morning after breakfast that I could just slip out maybe. So we've got these late firearm seasons across many states these days for antlerless deer. So I might say, well, I'll have breakfast with the family and then I'm going to go out for just an hour with the gun and I'm going to go walk the edges of some fields. And oftentimes that's not going to work when you're trying to hunt for one specific mature buck or something. But if you're trying to shoot any antlerless deer, you might happen to catch that doe that's still feeding just before stepping into the woods on the edge of the bean field. Or you might actually catch one when you glass over the hilltop and see that there's one just inside of the cover about to bed down and you can sneak within 100 yards or whatever. I found those little kind of get it in while you can kind of opportunities that are outside of the box end up sometimes being possible when you're targeting antlerless deer and are really fun. And when you're trying to do whatever you can to fill an antlerless tag and do your management responsibility, it's a great way to make it happen when you maybe don't have all the time in the world or you're trying to fit it in between different things. Those types of things are possible when it's this kind of hunt.
I agree. And, the nice thing is once deer seasons are done and hunters have left the woods, after a few days or a week, deer often start resuming some normal movement patterns anyway. So it's a great opportunity for that, where that may not have happened at the end of your rifle season, but, hey, it can happen now. Another benefit of that is, man, you have a perfect opportunity to do some postseason, or at least that's not postseason, but late season scouting to see where deer are moving, once all the hunters are leaving. So I think that you get some information to help you next year, as well as provide an opportunity to shoot an antlerless deer late.
Yeah.
Or maybe even a buck late if you still have your buck tag. Maybe you've already shot some antlerless deer and you're trying to add another one or still can fill your buck tag.
Yeah. This is a great time to try something new. That's for sure. What about the situation where somebody says, well, I already killed a buck this year and I only need one deer worth of meat in the freezer. Or maybe they killed 2 deer and they don't need any more meat. So this person who has a full freezer and they're saying, well, I would do this. I would shoot some does, but I don't need to eat it. What do you say to that person?
I think there's a bunch of folks that fall in that category. And I say, you know what? We have a perfect opportunity to help feed others. Today in the US, about 1 in 7 households are food insecure, meaning they don't have enough meat. This is a perfect way for a hunter to shoot a doe, which helps that deer herd, and then donate that to a needy family. Maybe it's somebody down the street. Maybe it's a friend or family member can take it to a soup kitchen. There are many venison donation processors across the country that can take that and get it into the food bank hands. And so that is a great thing that makes the hunters look like a champion of society. Society loves it that we're solving this antlerless deer under harvest problem and at the same time feeding people. And I get it, Mark. There's a bottleneck today with fewer processors than there used to be. I see it in my state of Pennsylvania. I know it's in your state of Michigan and elsewhere. We have met with a lot of state wildlife agencies about this issue, and we are trying to develop a national map of where venison processors are located. Pennsylvania is done, so we started in my home state of PA. We have that mapped now and are starting to add other states to provide a resource for hunters. Hey, here's a place you can take a deer to have it, processed. We have those listed on there. Hey, these ones are involved with venison donation programs, so it doesn't cost you anything to leave that. So I think this is going to be a tremendous resource for hunters because a lot just don't know where to go, particularly as we lose more venison processors. So we actually are working on trying to get some federal funding to increase the number of processors that are available to hunters, but then simultaneously making the current ones that are available, put it on a map to make it a resource for hunters to see where they are. So even if your freezer is full, I promise you there's somebody in your community that can use it. Get with an NDA branch in your area. We can help find a home for it, or your state wildlife agency, or your state venison donation program. Somebody needs that. It needs it desperately. And as a hunter, man, you can be the winner and provide that for them.
Yeah. So whether it be to get some information, as you just described, regarding processors, or finding that deer diagnosis, the doe harvest diagnosis, one sheeter you mentioned, or connecting with an NDA branch, or becoming a member, all of these things I know are over on the National Deer Association's website. Can you tell folks where to find that, how to get involved? Anything else you want to leave folks with today?
Sure. You can go to deerassociation.com. We provide all kinds of information there for hunters, research information, hunting information, recipes, the doe diagnosis, harvest, and all kinds of other stuff, that's all there for the taking. We encourage folks to grab it, sign up to be a member. There are different levels of membership. Our paid membership provides all kinds of discounts to some awesome hunting industry items. If you don't want to be a paid member, we have a free membership as well, which gets you our weekly newsletter to keep you up to date with all kinds of good information. So there's lots of ways to be able to get involved. And, if you want to do something positive for the future of our deer herds or our hunting heritage, man, being a National Deer Association member is the perfect place to start.
Terrific, Kip. As always, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for chatting.
All right. Good to see you, my friend.
You
as
well.
Have a great day.
All right. And that's going to do it for us. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for being here. Hope you had a very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, a wonderful time with your friends and family. Best of luck out there in the woods. Good luck filling some more doe tags. Let's keep that momentum moving. Let's get some does on the ground. Let's fill the freezers, share it with folks, make a positive difference for the environment, keep our ability to manage deer within the world of deer hunters rather than having some other entity have to do it. We can control the situation. We can influence the situation. We know the solution. We just got to get out there and do it. So here's to having a great antlerless season. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.